Hello everyone, Hoplite Mike back here with another video. Today we're going to be answering the question, how good are the barbarians in the Alexander expansion for Total War Rome Remastered? So there are various barbarian factions in the campaign. In the custom battle they are all represented under the Dehe faction symbol. So we're going to do what we usually do. I'm going to run through each of the units, give some commentary, then consider how good they are compared to the other barbarian factions in the base game and the other factions in this game. So we'll start with the infantry units then. So we've got one unit of peasants, spearmen, swordsmen, and sickle men. So we all know about the peasants. They have terrible fighting stats, 0 morale, they'll break almost instantly, so pretty much useless. And we'll move on to the next unit, being the spearmen. So the spearmen have pretty low morale of 4, so they'll break quite easily. Defense of 10, which is not too bad. Fairly low armor, which does leave them vulnerable to ranged fire. And a not too bad melee attack for a low tier unit. I think these stats are similar to the warband unit. So most barbarian factions in the base game, their sort of entry level unit is a spearman unit called the warband, and this unit is basically identical, has exactly the same stats. It's not too bad in the early game, but yeah, you just can't depend on it because of low morale. The only thing is it does have fairly decent unit size of 120, whereas most other units have about 80, so the numbers always give you a bit more staying power in battle, and that it takes you longer to break, but obviously the morale just isn't great. Next we have the Barbarian Swordsman, so straight away I'm seeing good morale of 10, so these will not break that easily. Melee attack of 13 is also solid. This is in line with elite tier infantry units from the base game. If you look at like the Roman cohorts, the urban cohort, etc., they have melee attack of between 10 and 12. 12 and 14, so this is definitely up there. Defense is definitely low at 7 and 0 armor, so very vulnerable to ranged fire. The barbarian factions in the base game, most of them have a generic swordsman unit that has defense of 12, melee attack of 10, and morale of 8. So this feels like a more offensive unit. Although having said that, these stats do seem similar to the Woad Warriors. Morale 10. Oh, okay. So no, this unit is in the base game. It's the Naked Fanatics. So the Germania has them, Gaul has them, I think Spain has them as well. They're essentially shock infantry that have really high attack and high morale but low defenses. You can use them to, they're basically sort of glass cannon units. You can use them to flank, and with decent charge, decent melee attack, and the war cry, you can rout enemy units very quickly. The downside is obviously that their defenses are really bad, and you can't really put them in the front line because they'll melt to ranged fire. So you have to kind of keep them back or just use them to flank. But solid addition to any roster, I would say. Last but not least, we have the Sickle Men. So straight away I'm seeing a low morale of 8. So this isn't great for... I mean, I'm assuming these are supposed to be the elite tier infantry because of the cost, but a morale of 8 is not very good for an elite tier infantry. You'd expect it to be about 10 or 12. Defense of 14 is solid, and melee attack of 14 is actually really good. There's very few units in the other barbarian factions that have a melee attack higher than 13. So most of the barbarian factions in the base game have the Chosen Swordsman as their elite tier infantry, and the Chosen Swordsman have a defense of 17, melee attack of 13, and a morale of 12. So this is comparable. The attack is slightly better, but the defense and the morale are much worse. So I don't think the trade-off of having +1 for attack is worth the drops in morale. I think the Spanish have something called the Bill Warriors, which have melee attack of 13, morale of 12, and defense of 12. So these are comparable to them, but obviously they have the much worse morale. Germania just have units which are high in attack and low in defense. So yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. I think if it had morale of 10, I'd be saying this is a very good unit. But it's just too low really for an elite tier. So next we have the range guys. Then we have barbarian archers and tribal slingers. So I think these barbarian archers are the same as the warband, the archer warband for Dacia. They have, I mean, defense is low, but it's what you'd expect from a low tier infantry unit. Morale 4 is also quite low, so they'll break easily, and melee attack is also not great. So between defense of 5 and melee attack of 3, they can't really handle themselves in melee combat. The offset to that is that their archer stats are actually pretty decent, so Missile attack of 7 is solid. Most archers in the base game have a missile attack of between 4 and 11. So 7 is definitely a step above what I would expect for a low tier archer unit. Missile range of 120 is also solid. The best archers in the game, in the base game, have a missile range of 170, so 120 is a respectable number. Altogether, I'd say this is a solid early game archer unit owing to the above average missile archer stats. So next we have the tribal slingers then. So get a boost in missile attack to 9, missile range stays the same, small increase to defense and a decent increase to attack. And importantly, that morale goes up to 8, which means that they have a bit more staying power in battle. They don't break as easily as the barbarian archers. So in the base game, there's 2 versions of the slinger. There's the kind of low tier version that factions like Britannia have, that has a missile attack of 4 and a morale of 4. This seems to be the upgraded slingers from the base game, of which I think there's 2. There's the Balearic slingers and the Rhodian slingers. So yeah, in general, I'd say this is a solid slingers unit. The missile attack's decent, missile range is decent, and morale is respectable. Altogether, I'd say that their ranged units are as good as any other barbarian faction in the base game. So, yep, now we'll move on to the horse guys. We've got the barbarian cavalry, horse archers, and general's bodyguard. So barbarian cav, straight out of the base game. Good defense, good attack, low morale for a... Well, it's low morale, but it's what you'd expect for a low tier unit. The thing about this unit is it's actually quite good because of how cost effective it is. It's only 400 denarii. So even though they have low morale and they break easily, you don't really mind if they do break because they're so cheap that you can just fill your armies up with them, and if a few break, that's fine, that's what you'd expect. So I'd say it's a good unit because it's cost effective, but not because it's a powerful unit. It's not powerful at all. It just has, decent early game stats for a cavalry unit that can break easily. You can't be aggressive with this unit. You can't charge it into enemy lines because it'll just break, especially in prolonged battles. So you just need to use it to flank and just cause chaos on the battlefield. So next we have the horse archers then. So I think these are the Scythian mercenaries from the base game. They have defense of 2, which is shocking, morale of 4, which is, as we discussed, pretty low, melee attack of 3, which is basically not usable, and decent archer stats. So I think this is the same as the barbarian archers, but just on horseback. So yeah, archer stats are good, everything else is rubbish. Horse archers are a solid addition to any roster because you can use them to win battles that you shouldn't really be able to win, in terms of, you can just ride around the battlefield, fire a few missiles, and if the enemy can't catch you, then you're basically untouchable and you can just, rack up the kills. So a solid addition to any roster, but again, not a powerful unit. If you do get caught with a defense of 2 and a morale of 4, you're not going to last too long. So lastly, we have the Barbarian General's Bodyguard. So I think this is also straight from the base game. I know Gaul and Dacia both have Gaul and Dacia have 2 general units. They have a pre-Marian and a post-Marian cavalry unit. This seems to be the pre-Marian, which would make sense because Alexander is before the Roman times. So morale of 12 is really good. They won't break. Melee attack of 12 is good for a cavalry unit, but probably slightly low for a general unit. And it's a similar story with the defense. Good for a cavalry unit, but bad for a general unit. So not too much to say about this unit. It's just a solid cavalry unit. The only other thing to note is that the numbers are a bit low as well. 24 men to a unit, which is a fair bit lower than the barbarian cavalry. And numbers do help in battle. It just means that you last a bit longer and you don't. It takes you longer to break. But yeah, most high tier cavalry units do have reduced numbers. That's standard in the game. So now that we've been through the full roster, how good is it compared to barbarian factions in the base game? So in terms of infantry, I'd say that it's worse than other barbarian factions in the base game, just because they don't have a sort of bread and butter mid-tier unit which just has decent defense and decent attack. They have this Barbarian Swordsman, which is essentially shock infantry. It's not solid at all. You can't really use this in your front line, so they would need a kind of mid-tier infantry unit. In terms of elite infantry, it's probably also worse as well. The Sickle Men have really good attack at 14, but the increase to attack is not worth the drop in morale and defense compared to the other barbarian factions. So the Chosen Swordsman, which is the elite tier infantry which most other barbarian factions have, is better than the Sickle Men because it has defense of 17 and much higher morale of 12. Even the Bull Warriors that the Spanish have would be better than this because they have morale of 12 and defense of 12 as well, I think. But yeah, you really need high morale on elite tier infantry unit because you need them to, you need the line to hold. If the line breaks, then that, you're going to lose most battles at that point. So the low morale just really kills this unit for me. But I think the Sickle Man is the only unit which is not from the base game. I think this is a unique unit, so it is cool they put this in, and I do like the way it looks. So moving on then to the ranged units, how good are these compared to the other barbarian factions? I'd say the ranged units are actually nearly as good as any other barbarian faction. Most barbarian factions in the base game only have 2 ranged units, and the barbarian archers are definitely a good early game ranged archer, and the slingers are solid. So I do like the ranged units, and I'd say it's the only barbarian faction which has a better lineup than this is the Gauls, which have the Forester Warband. The Forester Warband is arguably the best archer in the game. It has missile attack of 11, missile range of 170, good defense and good melee attack. So they've got the archer stats, and they can handle themselves in melee combat. But yeah, so I'd say the ranged units are probably on par with most other barbarian factions. So lastly then, we've got the cavalry. So I think with the cavalry, it's a similar story to the infantry. You've got kind of got both ends of the spectrum. You've got the low power but cost effective barbarian cavalry, which don't have great stats, but they're cost effective, so you can use a lot of them. Then they've got the other end of the spectrum being the general, which is a lot more solid, but you probably only expect 1 unit in the infantry, in the army, sorry. It's just missing a solid mid-tier cavalry unit that the barbarian factions in the base game have. So in the base game, both Dacia and Gaul, and potentially some others, have a unit called the Barbarian Noble Cavalry, which basically has defense of 15, melee attack of 9, and morale of 8. So it's just a much more solid unit that you can be more aggressive with and charge into enemy lines because of the combined increases to defense and morale. So yeah, because the roster is just missing that mid-tier cavalry unit, I'd say this is just worse than the other barbarian factions in the base game. We've discussed how good it is compared to the other barbarian factions in the base game, and in general it's a lot worse, but I mean, we kind of knew that just because of how many units it was missing. It's obviously lacking in certain places. So having compared it to the barbarian factions in the base game, how good is it in this expansion? So against Alexander, the main problem is that they have heavy cavalry units that you don't really have an answer to. If you look at the Royal Squadron and the Companion Cav, they both have fairly high attack and defense and morale. And if you look at the Dehe roster, there's just no answer to that. Your unit with the highest defense is the Sickle Man at 14, but because of the low morale, a couple of cavalry charges probably will just cause them to break. So against Alexander's Macedon, I'd say you don't really stand much of a chance. Against the Persians, so they are, like Alexander, they also have quite a well-rounded roster. They have decent cav, but pretty strong infantry in terms of these immortals and mercenary infantry. You've got high morale of 10, defenses around 14 or 15, and melee attack of 14 on this mercenary infantry here. So I don't think you have anything really that can hold up to that. The Sickle Men is your best chance, but they obviously have that low morale that we discussed, and you don't really have a mid-tier cavalry unit that you can use to flank effectively. Lastly then, against the Indians. So the Indian roster is slightly strange. It's got 1 melee unit, a bunch of archer units, and some cavalry, some elephants, and a chariot. I don't think this roster is really designed to be, the problem with this roster is that it has so many archer units, but it doesn't have a decent melee unit to protect them. These Indian Spearmen have defense of 10 and melee attack of 5, and I think you'd probably be able to break through a line of Indian Spearmen with the Sickle Man to get through to the archers. You also would be filling your armies with barbarian cavalry, which would allow you to flank the archers. So against India, I think you'd do pretty well, but I think most factions would do well against India anyway. In terms of how you build an army, I think you probably have to be using the Sickle Man as your front line as the only elite tier infantry unit. You obviously want to get the Slingers in there as your elite tier ranged unit, and lastly you'd be wanting the Barbarian Cavalry to fill up. You'd want a lot of Barbarian Cav in this army just because you know with that low morale it's going to break, so you need a lot of cavalry units to be able to make up for that fact. And lastly, I'd probably have a couple of infantry units of swordsmen in there as well to flank and get the benefit of that high morale, high melee attack, and decent charge bonus. You could also adopt a sort of horse archer build where you just have lots of units of horse archers, and lastly some barbarian cav. So you just charge around the battlefield, firing off the missiles with these horse archers, picking off units, and then use the barbarian cavalry to kind of run in and finish off units that are already depleted. So I think that's mainly it for the video. In terms of how good this barbarian faction is, it's worse than the barbarian factions in the base game, just owing to the barbarian factions in the base game having better elite infantry and better cavalry units. And in terms of how good it does against other factions again in this game, it's worse against. It's not very good against Alexander's Macedon because you don't have an answer to the cavalry. It's not very good against Persia because you don't have an answer to the elite infantry, but it probably would beat the Indians owing to their slightly strange roster. So I think that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed the content. Please like and subscribe if you did, and leave a comment if you have any feedback. I'm always looking for feedback, but thanks for watching.